I've been reading John Keegan's The Face of Battle recently, a truly superb book which examines the battles of Agincourt, Waterloo and the Somme in an attempt to convey to the reader a sense of what it would have been like to be in each of these battles, and also attempts to display some common themes which soldiers of any age would have understood. Whilst I could dedicate an entire video to this book, and may yet do so, the reason for my making this one is quite different. In Keegan's section on Waterloo, he spends some time examining a theme which I have found myself explaining on numerous occasions to various people who knew of my love of military history. Why did soldiers in the black powder age stand in lines to get shot at? At a basic level, this question makes sense. One's natural impulse when heavy objects are approaching at speed is to move out of the way, yet soldiers in this era by and large did not. So why was this the case? Before examining Keegan's reasonings, I would first like to clarify why these soldiers were ordered into lines to begin with. There are two primary reasons, the first of which is the limitation of the muzzle-loading musket. These weapons were slow to load and fire, and horribly inaccurate. The only way to utilise them effectively was en masse, and a block of infantry opening fire simultaneously, or in groups as British troops would learn to do so effectively, was much more damaging than dispersed single shooters. The second was for reasons of control. Armies of the period operated as large units, with precision drill being key to their effectiveness. An officer would retain little control over his regiment if they were dispersed, and the masses of smoke generated on battlefields of the day could even see him lose where his men were. So close order was key to the retention of effective command. The blocks of infantry were thus a tactically sound creation, but what kept soldiers in them? How were their nerves steeled enough to stand firm when cannonballs were ploughing through their ranks and walls of cavalry were bearing down upon them? I had often marvelled at the courage of such men, and Keegan provided a fascinating analysis. Whilst his focus of study is Waterloo, that battle was in many ways the apotheosis of black powder warfare, and insofar as motivation of troops is concerned, it describes perfectly the battlefield situation of the period as a whole. Keegan first noted that officers would, when circumstances permitted, allow their regiments to take cover. When there was no immediate danger of cavalry or infantry attack, many regiments would be permitted to sit or lie down, to rest or reduce the impact of cannon fire. Yet, when ordered to stand, it was seen as unseemly for troops to flinch when fired upon, let alone duck. Major Alexander Mercer recounted an incident in the Battle of Waterloo where a doctor was observed scrambling on hands and knees to evade incoming French fire, to the resounding laughter of nearby British soldiers. These men, and Ensign William Leake observed, would remain steady even when shells were exploding amidst their ranks. When some men of Leake's regiments were chided by an officer for ducking as a cannon shot flew overhead, instantaneously, quote, every man's head went as straight as an arrow. The sense of pride instilled by the uniform and commanders were enhanced by the presence of regimental colours. These large symbols, of great practical utility given the difficulty in maintaining unit cohesion, were viciously defended by the troops, and there are many examples of heroic defences or suicidal attacks to return stolen colours. Ensign Christie, for example, was stabbed in the eye by a French lancer, who then attempted to ride away with the colour of the 44th Essex, but, quote, notwithstanding the agony of his wound, Christie flung himself upon the colour, wrestled it away from the Frenchman, and fell to the ground on top of it. But it was not mere pride and professionalism that kept the men in line. As Keegan explains, the purpose of cannon fire was to break up the ordered ranks of infantry. Men in formation, as I have noted, are easier to command and control than those dispersed over a greater distance. A formation that failed to hold its cohesion was easy prey for cavalry or opportunistic enemy infantry who could lay about them with shot and bayonet. It must be noted that, despite the rational needs of self-preservation, not all infantry did hold together. Amongst Wellington's forces at Waterloo were many irregular troops of varying nationalities, many of whom were less than steadfast soldiers. Many of the Dutch, Belgian and minor German troops he commanded did break and run under the French cannonade, and a majority of their cavalry refused to charge. No British regiments were to flee the field on the day of the battle, but there are accounts of individual soldiers shirking their duties. Keegan notes that the promise of plunder, so often a motivation in earlier ages, had little motivational factor in the Waterloo campaign. Many soldiers sold their loot at very low prices, fully expecting not to make it home alive in order to make a profit of it. The levels of prize money available for the sale of prisoners pale when compared to the ransoms of the pre-black powder age. Drink, he goes on to state, was a far greater motivator for many. There are many accounts of officers and NCOs carrying personal flasks of spirits. One Sergeant Morris was carrying 3 canteens of gin for the wounded, but was led to share some with a friend. A Sergeant Lawrence of the 40th Regiment of Foot was frequently visited by his CO when the latter required a tot of spirits to steady his nerve during the Battle of Waterloo. The commissary of the 3rd Division certainly surpass expectation, however, for their rolling of an entire barrel of alcohol into the middle of an infantry square during the battle itself, upon the order of their general, no less. The distribution of drink, Keegan notes, is mentioned in almost every regimental memoir. What Keegan emphasises as one of the greatest motivations for troop in this age, however, was that of simple coercion. The less stable foreign troops under Wellington's command, for example, were often held in place by lines of British cavalry standing to their rear in a screen of sabres and hooves. One British regiment was even recorded to have fired upon some fleeing Belgians in a spontaneous act of professional disgust. Officers of Brunswick and Belgium were reported to have struck their troops if they wavered, whilst one British soldier recounted a French officer physically pushing a man into line as Union Brigade cavalry approached them. The threat of violence from the enemy, however, appears to have had a far greater impact on soldiers of the era than combat itself. At the Battle of Waterloo, several sources noted that when the final assault of the French Imperial Guard was repulsed by the withering close-range fire of British forces, it was the men at the back who broke first. The ability to return fire, it is postulated, calmed men greatly by giving them a sense of power over circumstances. As Julius Caesar once said, "It is easier to find men who will volunteer to die than to find those who are willing to endure pain with patience." The infantry square formation, synonymous with Napoleonic warfare, perhaps best demonstrates the fortitude of the soldiers of the era. A square of well-trained infantry, so long as their nerve held, could easily repulse an attack by enemy cavalry, and the close proximity of the soldier to his comrades would keep him steady. Soldiers would stay firmly rooted in square, even when subjected to the heaviest of bombardments, as the apparent safety of the close formation provided them with a sense of security that a long line of men simply could not. Keegan notes that skirmishers would often retreat to nearby infantry squares for safety, thereby perversely putting themselves at more risk of enemy fire, as artillery would not waste their shots on individuals, but would happily expend them at larger blocks of troops. The only soldiers rendered safer from attack by the square were the wounded, as they could be dragged to the middle, surrounded by armed friends and out of reach of the enemy. Thus the square, whilst objectively more dangerous than the line, was contrarily easier to keep soldiers together in, due to the feeling of security instilled by close order. The tenacity of soldiers in square could even surprise contemporaries. During the assault on La Haye-Saint, Sir Alexander Cadogan is said to have asked a comrade why one of his infantry squares was lying down on the ground. He was told in response, "That is the position from which the 30th and 73rd have just moved." The regiments had taken over 300 casualties without breaking formation. The tactical formation of the infantry square, Keegan goes on to postulate, may have been as much a tool of coercion as battlefield necessity. By condensing one's troops into a smaller area, the officer would be better positioned to enforce his will upon them. General Lejeune recounted seeing a French sergeant holding his men in line by the press of his halberd, and there is little to suggest that officers of other nations would not resort to similar means. The edged weapons of sergeants of the period, it is speculated, may have been of far more use in coercing their own troops than attacking the enemy's. This is not to suggest, however, that the officers worked purely through coercion. The British officers were particularly renowned for their bravery and coolness under fire, motivated as they were by a strong sense of personal honour and competition with their peers. This competitive spirit had long pervaded the ranks of the British, where the purchasing of commissions had allowed any man with the means to take a command. This lack of meritocratic promotion, however, encouraged each officer to strive to prove that he deserved the position he held. Generals like the Duke of Marlborough or Wolfe had been famous for enduring hazards alongside their men, and this trend of heroic leadership was only encouraged as British society evolved. When the Duke of Wellington stated that the Battle of Waterloo was won on the playing fields of Eton, he was referring to the principles of competition and striving for exceptionalism that the British public school system had instilled more broadly through society. To summarise the points made herein, we may observe that men held their positions on such battlefields as Blenheim and Waterloo through a variety of reasons that, to even those with no knowledge of battle, may be well understood. From the simple expedience of the implicit safety of holding formation, to the strong psychological motivation of standing shoulder to shoulder with armed friends. The fear of punishment and the pride of professionalism, all undercut with the fortifying Dutch courage, combined to keep the soldiers of all ranks upright, even in the face of the most punishing fire.